Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Given all of the controversy around Bill C-5, which is the Federal Major Projects Bill, I wanted to have a conversation about Henry VIII clauses, because the second half of Bill C-5 is one giant Henry VIII clause. And in the discussion over the past week or so about this bill, as it was making its way through the House of Commons at an extraordinarily rapid pace because the government invoked closure on it, a lot of people in my socials didn't necessarily understand what that necessarily meant. And so I figured I should give us a bit of a quick primer on what that is actually supposed to mean. And so a Henry VIII clause is a piece of legislation, or a clause in a piece of legislation, that basically allows the government to do an end run around Parliament by allowing it to change laws, or if not change, then repeal laws or so on, but without going through the regular legislative process, but rather through regulation, which Cabinet can do on its own. And that's why it's a big problem. As for why it's called Henry VIII Clause, it's because it references the Proclamation by the Crown Act of 1539, which is what Henry VIII and his right-hand man at the time, Thomas Cromwell, were using in order to basically rule by decree. Cromwell tried to make this basically a legislative excuse for Henry VIII to rule by decree, but this is essentially where the term comes from. Now, this proclamation, or this Proclamation Act, was repealed in 1547. But the use of proclamations ended up leading to the Glorious Revolution, which is what secured the supremacy of Parliament. And that's also why Parliament gets to choose who the king is, because of the powers that Parliament obtained for itself during the Glorious Revolution. So that's just a little bit of history, but that's just a sense of where this comes from, and why it's seen as kind of a bad thing. And in Bill C-5, the Henry VIII clause in there is pretty broad. And if you look at it, it goes through how essentially the criteria they plan to use to designate something as a project of national interest. But once something has been designated, the bill says the governor and council may, on recommendation of the minister responsible for an enactment, make regulations exempting one or more national interest projects from the application of any provision of that enactment, or of any provision of regulations made under the enactment, and varying the application of any provision referred to in paragraph A in relation to one or more national interest projects. So basically that's saying that they can regulate their way out of federal laws based on something they consider to be of national importance. And it's an extremely broad power, and that was what some of the problems were that this came up against during debate. Now, in committee, the opposition had put a few limits on what that broad power could regulate its way out of, but it was very telling as to the list that they kind of circumscribed around it. So for the Conservatives, those things were things like the Conflict of Interest Act, those kinds of things, because, of course, they have this whole, I'm not going to say quite conspiracy, but it's kind of conspiratorial, going on about how apparently everything Mark Carney is doing is in the service of Brookfield, and because he still basically holds a lot of Brookfield shares, that it is directly enriching him even though all of his shares are now in a blind trust, and we don't know what the schedule of those being sold and replaced with other stocks are. Regardless, this is kind of the thing that they've been going with for the last number of months, and so they wanted to really get that on the record, so that they're stopping Mark Carney from enriching himself, even though that's unlikely what was actually happening. The NDP ensured that they circumscribed things around unions and union legislation, so that this bill couldn't be used to get its way out of those kinds of obligations, and so on. They did put they also exempted the Indian Act from that, but I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the issue so much as it would be, for example, UNDRIP legislation, which is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which requires that things that happen on Indigenous lands require free, prior, and informed consent, and that could be the big barrier for some of these projects. If you have an Indigenous community or nation over whose territory these projects want to cross, that they would object to, if they don't give their free, prior, and informed consent, that could ordinarily stop some of these projects, but this Henry VIII clause could essentially allow them to get over that entirely. The other thing that we need, out of those things that the Conservatives in particular didn't ensure that the Henry VIII clause couldn't touch, were things like environmental legislation, because of course they want a Henry VIII clause to get around environmental legislation. This is the thing that they've been salivating over for years. And because this particular piece of legislation has a 5-year sunset clause, that goes into the next parliament, whenever that is. If the Conservatives happen to form government within those 5 years, well, they've got this giant Henry VIII clause that they can use with abandon. That's still very broad, and which they can use to ram any project they would like through, regardless of things like UNDRIP legislation or any kind of environmental legislation. And they can say, well, this was a liberal law, so it's perfectly valid that we use it. And it strikes me as somewhat of a problem that Carney and the people around him did not see that this might actually be a problem for them in the future, because why wouldn't they? So suffice to say, these are some of the problems with this Henry VIII clause, and why it's a problem. We really shouldn't have laws that allow the executive to get around the legislature, particularly in such a broad manner. Ontario right now has one that's basically worse. Their Bill 5, which is just a coincidence in terms of the numbering, creates these special economic zones that basically allows the government, or the provincial government, to render them lawless under provincial law. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of limit as to what gets to be declared a special economic zone. So they could theoretically declare the GTA a special economic zone, and it becomes lawless under all kinds of provincial law and regulation, which is also a problem. I know they're trying to use the example that they want to develop the Ring of Fire, but a lot of the problems there are not actually with provincial environmental law or something, or things like that. A lot of it are the local First Nations, who have essentially been screwed over by previous project proponents, and who are reluctant to grant new projects on their lands without some kind of a revenue sharing agreement, so that they don't get screwed over again. But Doug Ford doesn't want to seem to listen to their objections or their concerns, And so we get things like this much more giant and problematic Henry VIII clause in Ontario. Other question that you might have is, aren't these unconstitutional? And largely they are constitutional because it is Parliament delegating its authority to the executive. We haven't had a lot of case law where the Supreme Court says, no, this is out of bounds, and therefore we're going to strike it down. It's possible that could still happen if something is considered overly broad. But for the most part, this has all been constitutional, which is also part of the problem because this is Parliament signing away its own powers. And that always can be a problem. We'll see how this particular Henry VIII clause in C-5 shakes itself out, because it's almost certainly going to pass the Senate this week. However, it's something that we need to think about. Just shaking, going, we're in an economic crisis right now, so we need these powers, isn't always necessarily good. A good excuse. They did try this during the pandemic. Bill Morneau tried to include a Henry VIII clause in a pandemic relief package, and the Conservatives rightly cried bloody murder over it, and it was removed. But this time the Conservatives want these Henry VIII powers, so they're letting them go through, which again should have been a red flag for the people in Carney's office. However, they don't seem to think so. And so here we are. Hopefully this is not a trend. Carney says it's not going to be, but Carney has also been demonstrating that he's the kind of person who would rather seek forgiveness than permission. I think that's generally a problem. A Henry VIII clause is pretty much an ultimate exercise in seeking forgiveness rather than permission. And that kind of tends to be a problem for a lot of things, particularly major projects when they go wrong. So we'll see if his self-described limitation of consultation is actually going to be sufficient to hold these powers in any kind of check for the next 5 years. But I'm a little bit pessimistic, and we'll have to see. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale and JournoDale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.